growing up in college and as a young adult, and actually sometimes I'm still able to do it. I love to get out into the mountains, and in fact, I've been able to participate with my dad in taking young people, young high school students out there as well for a 2-week trip that he does every summer, and I've been able to go as a leader on that for many years as well. And so, but I love getting out into the mountains and into the wilderness, and one of the things that you quickly learn when you're out in the mountains is that sometimes you're not sure if the mountain that you're trying to hike to or climb up, you're not sure if the one that you can see in the distance is the one that you're going for or not. And so sometimes you have your maps out and your topographic maps and you're trying to figure out, is this the one, or is there another one further on that we can't see right now that we're heading toward? And sometimes when you're leading young people too, it's kind of like a kid in the car, it's like, are we there yet? I don't know, I think that's it. And sometimes even when you're on the mountain, you have this what we sometimes call like false summits. You're climbing up the mountain and you look and you see and you think that's the top, but then when you get there you realize it's not the top, and there's a further summit that is actually the top of the mountain. The reason I bring this up is because we hear about mountains in our second reading from St. Paul. In fact, we hear about, he's comparing and contrasting actually 2 different mountains. And the first mountain is Mount Sinai, and the second mountain that St. Paul compares that to and contrasts Mount Sinai to is Mount Zion. And Mount Sinai is obviously the mountain where God comes and gives Moses the 10 Commandments. And that's a really important part of our history. Not just the Israelite history, it's a part of our history too. Because the Israelites are our ancestors in our faith and believe in God. And what happens at Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments is very important, because it's God really for the first time meeting and interacting with the Israelites in setting up this relationship. It's God coming to the Israelites and saying, I want to be your God. And so, when we remember, it's a very dramatic encounter. And St. Paul remembers all of that in today's second reading. Talks about fire, blazing fire, and gloomy darkness. There's this cloud that descends, and there's earthquakes and lightning and thunder. Every time God speaks, there's earthquakes and violence, and people are terrified. If they even touch the mountain, they are told they will die. And we talked last week about how when Moses comes back down, they can't even look at Moses, who's just the reflection of God's face. He's glowing so much that the people tremble at just seeing Moses. And in fact, they come to Moses at one point and they beg, and St. Paul talks about this, they beg that no message be further addressed to them. They basically ask God to stop speaking, because it's so terrifying, so awesome, in the real sense of the word, in the sense that it inspires awe. And it is really largely dominated by fear. And there is a sense that St. Paul recalls all of this in this second reading. But St. Paul is writing after Jesus. He's writing to people who after the resurrection. And so there's a temptation that St. Paul is addressing, which is the temptation to see Mount Sinai as the mountain, as the stopping place, as the destination. That's where we're going. That's where we're supposed to stay. That's what we're aiming for. Is Mount Sinai the God of fear, the God of trembling, the God of lightning and thunder? St. Paul says there's the temptation to stop there, to see that as the destination, as the end of the story. And many of us, in fact, do still live in that relationship with God. That is our relationship. Fear, trembling, you better do it, or else we're going to die. St. Paul is very clear, though, because he brings up a second mountain. He says, Mount Sinai is not the destination. The destination is, in fact, the mountain that is beyond Mount Sinai. A mountain that the Israelites could not see in this moment of Mount Sinai, but in fact is the greater mountain. It is Mount Zion. He describes Mount Zion being heaven, the actual dwelling place of God. St. Paul says, no, you have approached Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, with countless angels in festal gathering, the assembly of the firstborn enrolled in heaven, the spirits of the just made perfect, Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, Christ, the saints, angels singing for joy, heaven. St. Paul says, Mount Zion, that's the destination. That is the mountain that we're heading for. And while we may be tempted sometimes to only see Mount Sinai, to focus on that, to think that that is the end of the story, that we just sit on Mount Sinai waiting for the end of time. St. Paul reminds us, no, we press on. Press on for Mount Zion. We're called. Now, many people then think, when we hear this, many people think, well, does that mean that we are supposed to put dynamite in Mount Sinai and blow it up? If it's all over with? No. That's not. Jesus says, I come not to erase one single letter of the law. Mount Sinai is a part of our story. It's not a part that we just, oh, well, that we forget about all that stuff and that's gone. No, we remember that. It still is a mountain. It's part of the destination, but it's not the final stop. We don't just get to Mount Sinai and then set camp and stop there and live our life on Mount Sinai. And this reveals, I think, something that's very important to us. What was the deal with Mount Sinai? Why was there fear and trembling and thunder and lightning? Was God just in a bad mood? Has he outgrown that? Was God childish? Or was he, not properly mentally balanced? What was going on? What we see in that is God reveals to the Israelites in that first encounter what they needed to see of him. They needed to, that was their belief, that was what they thought God's did. And certainly that side that God reveals of himself is a part of himself. We ought to fear God. We hear in the Bible that fear is the first stage of wisdom. Fear of God. So it's not that was like God pretending to be a vengeful or fearful God. No, that's part of him. But he reveals himself in that way to the Israelites because in a sense they needed to see that. They needed to know and enter into that relationship with him. They couldn't have handled Mount Sinai. They needed Mount Sinai first. We do too. That's part of our story. It doesn't go away. But we're called again to Mount Sinai. And what we recognize in that as well, when we see how God treats the Israelites and how he brings them through a process to Mount Zion, we recognize in that same way that he treats us the same way. He brings us along in time. He's constantly trying to help us get to Mount Zion. He's giving us what we need. We thank him for his patience with us. We thank him for his patience with the Israelite people, but also today with us as well. We come here to pray for the strength to continue to travel on, to not stop on Mount Sinai, but to recognize the mountain that we have truly been destined for, Mount Zion, which is